I'm going to keep my introductions relatively brief. Ryan Coyne is assistant professor of the philosophy of religions here at the Div School. Besides having written the book we will be discussing today, Professor Coyne is currently completing a project on Nietzsche and faith and has a third book project underway on deconstruction and method in the philosophy of religion. So this is the first part of a kind of trilogy on the major figures of continental philosophy of religion that we can look forward to. Following Professor Coyne's comments on his book, we will hear remarks from Professor Gregory Fried and Professor Jean-Luc Marion. Gregory Fried is professor and chair of the philosophy department at Suffolk University, Boston, and is not only one of the best-known contemporary scholars in the work of Martin Heidegger and someone who has played a prominent role in recent public discussions of the Black Notebooks, he is also a graduate of the University of Chicago, having received a PhD from the Committee on Social Thought in 1994. Professor Jean-Luc Marion is the Greeley Professor of Catholic Studies, and I think has appointments in philosophy, the Div School, and social thought. And he's professor of the philosophy of religions and theology. He is a professor at the Sorbonne, he's a member of the French Academy, and he is arguably the greatest living representative of the phenomenological tradition in the world. I say arguably, but I don't expect much argument. Under normal circumstances, one might be nervous to see this much intellectual firepower brought to bear on a first book. But I can assure you, if you haven't read it, that this is a truly exceptional book. Not only a remarkable contribution to Heidegger's scholarship, but also a deep meditation on the nature of philosophic influence and the complicated shapes it can take. So I'm very excited to see where the discussion goes. So I will try to keep the comments within their time allotment so that we can have 15 minutes or so of Q&A at the end. So please join me in welcoming Professor Coyne to the podium.
Thank you, Mark, for that very generous introduction. Let me begin by not only thanking Thomas Levergood for the invitation, and Lumen Christi for the invitation, and Mark Franzen for his work on this event, but also to thank all of you for coming. It's nice to be here among friends, and I would also like to thank ahead of time the panelists, my fellow panelists who have agreed to respond to this book so generously. So I will try to begin to open our discussion with only a few brief comments about the project and really its genesis by way of background and to set up discussion. When I began this project, I think it was common knowledge that the reading of Augustine had played an important role in the genesis of being in time. But it seemed to me that the nature of the debt that Heidegger's philosophy owed to this reading and the effects of having enlisted Augustine in certain ways to develop what Heidegger called a hermeneutic approach to phenomenology were not fully appreciated or widely recognized. So in the first stage of the project, I focused mainly on the early Heidegger, by which I mean Heidegger between, let's say, 1918 and 1926-27, the publication of Being in Time being in 1927. And in the midst of that, of course, the reading of Paul and of Augustine in 1920-21, right? So at the beginning of this attempt to develop a hermeneutic phenomenology. I knew that Heidegger had said repeatedly in 1925, and then again 2 years later in Being in Time, that he had derived the central concept that he used to describe the human being or human Dasein, that is to say, care, Sorge, from his reading of Augustine's Confessions and from the Psalm commentaries, the Psalm expositions text. But there were 2 points that I discovered in researching this that I found striking. The first was that, as I try to spell out in the book, that Augustine played a much larger role in Heidegger's early critique of Cartesian metaphysics than I had appreciated. And so I tried to spell that out in the book. And the question for Heidegger was to show that the Cartesian subject for him, which was a subject that was marked by self-certainty, had to be reversed and had to be articulated as a radical uncertainty. And this was, I think, the importance of Augustine in articulating a view of finitude, human finitude, as characterized by kind of constant self-questioning and anxiety. And that's where you have the role of the quaestio, the self as a question, in his reading of Augustine. Now, the second thing is that the concept of care in Heidegger's reading of Augustine was linked to a whole set of other concepts in Augustine, and it was following that trail that led me to something important, something that pushed the inquiry beyond a simple question of influence, but that raised, for me, what was strictly a philosophical question. And that is, the concept of care for Heidegger was tied to the notion of life as molestia, or trouble, that we are troubled, we are anxious in life. And that you can understand the concept of life in Augustine divorced from its Neoplatonic context, because Heidegger tried to strip away the Neoplatonism from Augustine. It's an impossible task, but that's what he tried to do. But you couldn't understand the concept of vita, of life, without making sense of it in terms of anxiety and troubledness, right? And so I saw initially that the concept of care was linked to the problem of the vita vitarum, the life of my life. What is the source, or the center of life for Augustine? And it was here that I saw that the problem of care was linked to that of fruitio, or to enjoyment, the famous Augustinian distinction between use and enjoyment. That in the Confessions, when there's in Book 10 of the Confessions, we have the search for God. One of the ways in which Heidegger is, I think, innovative as a reader of Augustine is that he doesn't think the search for God is monolithic. He thinks that there's a transformation at the center of it. Augustine is looking initially for God as if God is something that can be found, an object. But then the search is transformed and then becomes a search for the life of my life. And the concept of fruitio, that is the concept of enjoyment, the distinction being that for Augustine, to use something is to refer it to something else and end beyond it, but to enjoy something is to cling to an object out of love for its own sake. It's this idea of clinging to God that became crucial for Heidegger as a reader of Augustine. But Heidegger didn't see enjoyment in terms that were at all antithetical to molestia or to anxiety. So the highest form of the relation to God became one of utter anxiety and utter restlessness. So I knew at that moment that I had a philosophical problem, because the importance for Augustine, from Heidegger's point of view, was that he could help us articulate what the nature of concrete lived experience is. Right? But Heidegger, in Being and Time, of course, thinks of Dasein as a whole, as a unified whole. Having taken this idea of life as troubledness from Augustine, he was using a reference that didn't quite match up with what he needed it to do. That is to say, life for Augustine is not anything that can be treated as a unified whole, because it is linked to what is most intimate to myself, that is something that is more interior to myself than even myself, that is to say, God. Right? So the first stage was thinking about this issue, the unity of life, factical life experience. It wasn't, the second stage of the project came about through this meditation, or this reflection upon fruitio, or Augustinian fruitio, as it reappears in the later Heidegger. So in 1946, we have this attempt on Heidegger's part to read Anaximander as offering us the earliest saying of being in Western metaphysics. That is the beginning of the attempt to work out the meaning of being. And we have this a series of words, or actually two words, that Anaximander uses to describe the meaning of being, according to Heidegger, one of which is use, or to kraion. And Heidegger makes sense of this reference by borrowing once again from Augustine. I found this very strange. That is, he says that to kraion, use, can be translated as Augustinian fruitio. That is, to have something on hand, to cling to it out of love for its own sake. This reference from Augustine is supposed to make sense of something from the pre-Socratics. And I didn't really understand what was going on there until I tried to piece together the ways in which the debt to Augustine, having been established in the early Heidegger, reverberates throughout the corpus. So the book is an attempt to give an account of that. I would just say that when I handed the book in to the publisher, the final copy, it was early 2014. And I want to end by saying one thing that I would do differently now. It was early 2014. It was about a month before the first volume of the so-called Black Notebooks came out in German. The Black Notebooks, this volume has now been translated into English. It came out this month. And these are the notebooks that Heidegger kept from the early 30s to the early 70s. And so I didn't have them at my disposal when I wrote this book. And so I've been thinking a lot about them and their role in the corpus and how they're going to change how we read Heidegger. The last chapter in my book is on the nature of retraction. My claim in that book is that Heidegger doesn't offer us anything that resembles a retraction, as does Augustine. But instead, he makes of retraction a sort of philosophical theme. That is, he tries to understand being itself as retraction. I think that in general, the conclusions or the theme of that chapter is valid from my perspective. I would still defend its argument. But there is one thing I would like to change, which is that in the Black Notebooks, we have a series of attempts on Heidegger's part to reflect upon thinking as erring and what it means to err in thinking. And it's clear that starting in 1933 or early 1934, Heidegger came to see his rectoral address of 1933 at Freiburg as a great error. But so often, almost always, he lays the blame upon others. He doesn't take responsibility for upon himself, or he lays the blame upon being itself. But there's one moment in the Black Notebooks that I've discovered so far in which this may not be the case. It's grammatically ambiguous, but it may not be the case, and it strikes me as quite important for understanding how the Black Notebooks work. It's at the end of the fourth notebook, which Heidegger is saying, how could he have miscalculated so badly in giving this lecture, the self-assertion of the German university, thinking that the university was a way forward politically and intellectually. How could he have miscalculated? And here's the answer. How was this miscalculation possible? Because courage was lacking to face what I already knew. Courage for coming to terms with the death of God, with the abandonment of being and the current appearance of beings. Courage to face what we already know is, as Nietzsche says, so rare. Now, he doesn't say, I lacked courage. He doesn't say, I, Martin Heidegger, lacked the courage to face what I already knew, that is, to come to terms with the death of God. But he says that courage is lacking. And it strikes me that to think of the Black Notebooks as an attempt on his part, for better or for worse, and it is, I would say, wholly for worse, you could imagine that the Black Notebooks is his attempt to gather the courage to face the death of God. So that's something that I wish I had had at my disposal and would have changed how I had written this book. But thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My thanks as well to Lumen Christi, to Tom Levergood, and to Mark Franson for setting this up and for inviting me to this occasion. I also want to note that indeed I am a graduate of the University of Chicago, the Committee on Social Thought, and it is an enormous honor and pleasure for me to be back here for the first time in any official capacity, and to have that opportunity today in a building where with James Gustafson I read The City of God on a weekly basis in his office, and to come and talk about Martin Heidegger and Augustine. It is truly an honor. And let me begin by thanking Ryan for the opportunity by reading his book and asking to have me be invited. And I want to say that Heidegger's Confessions is one of the most engrossing interpretations of Heidegger's philosophical trajectory that I have had the pleasure to read in quite some time. Not only did I learn a great deal from it, for I am not particularly a theologian, not only did you write in a particularly lucid way about an author whose conceptual vocabulary, let alone his arguments, are notoriously challenging, and not only do you weave together, and by the way, I wrote my comments in the form of a letter to Ryan, which I sent to him, so I'm going to continue in that mode. You did what is most important of all. You have given me a great deal to think about, and to think about in a new and unexpected ways regarding Martin Heidegger's development. So what I propose to do here today is to repay that debt to such a fine book by delineating the questions that it raises for me now in how I understand what is most at issue in the work of Martin Heidegger. And I have 7 questions for Ryan, and I have, may I have my watch so I can time myself? I'm not going to go on past my allotted time, so if I don't get to all 7 questions, you have them in your hand. So I take as a preliminary clue for my response your claim that what motivated Heidegger's first encounter with the Christian authors he examines, Augustine especially, is the conviction that our factical life as it is lived, life as what is at issue for us, as what is most our own, has fallen away from philosophical exploration and lapsed into obscurity. As you rightly point out, Heidegger elevated Aristotle's phronesis over theoria because the latter occupies the position of detached, supposedly objective observer of things and of life, while phronesis promises access to how we make judgments concretely and grasp hold of a concrete situation in its entirety, starting from the purpose of action, or that for the sake of which all action must be taken. That last bit's a quote from Marion. You sum this up beautifully. In practical reasoning for Heidegger, the being of the one who reasons is at stake in the reasoning itself. So, this at stake, this at issue, is what Heidegger hopes will lead to an account of how factical life unveils itself in its being as an articulated structural totality. So I believe that we tend to lose sight of what is at issue in Heidegger's radical inquiry, because he ends up doing something quite paradoxical. Heidegger produces an extraordinarily abstract and abstruse philosophy of the radical particularity and specificity of life as it is lived, as one's own. We can lose track of what Heidegger said in a letter to Karl Löwith in 1921 during that early period of his work. Here it is. I work concretely and factically out of my own I am, out of my intellectual and in general my factical origin, milieu, life context, out of that which is accessible to me from these as the living experience within which I live. Despite the extraordinarily abstruse text that he produces, Heidegger in effect insists that he is philosophizing not for the sake of theoria, but rather for phronesis, for the sake of the fullest possible engagement in life, in being here, not in losing ourselves in a somewhere else. He is for Dasein rather than Dortsein, for this world, not for another world. So now on to my first formal question to you. What is the status of this I am that Heidegger focuses upon in the early period? Of course, the I am is a major theme of your book. From the reading of Heidegger on Paul's cruciform temporality of waiting for Christ's parousia, to Augustine's cura, to Descartes' cogito. You are entirely right to remind us that what Heidegger finds so compelling in Augustine is this cura, the care that animates our engagement with the world as a whole that matters to us. By asking about the status of this I am, though, I want to do so through the lens you provide, the distinction between the two philosophical modes of theoria and phronesis. In the letter to Löwit, Heidegger frames his work concretely as factical, his life context as a living experience, the lebendige Erfahrung within which I live. To be, then, is to be situated, enmeshed in a life context, there, in it, da. In the letter, for example, Heidegger tells Löwit that for him, this is the life context of the university, within which the I must of life as lived engages the factical challenges of the university, there and now, as they are posed for philosophy. Surely this also has something to do with Heidegger's political engagement. It is precisely this lived concreteness, situated in time and place, that he complains has been lost as a philosophical zone of inquiry in favor of abstractions that rob life of its specificity. And as you note, Heidegger believes that the model of philosophical knowing as theoria performs exactly this vaporization of living experience in favor of a detached and changeless staring at. Instead, Heidegger wants philosophy to explore knowing as phronesis, which he deconstructs from Aristotle to jettison its ethical teleology in favor of using it as an entry point to this worldly enmeshed mode of knowing. Frankly, in all of this, Heidegger resembles Socrates more than he might care to admit. The Socrates who proclaims that the unexamined life is not worth living. And this examining necessarily involves endless questioning, both theoretical and practical. To restate it, my first question is this: how do you see his taking over of Augustine's cura, as well as his exploration past what you interpret as Heidegger's turn as ways of thinking the I am through this lens of phronesis? To put an even finer point on this, one that perhaps reverses the treatment you give of sin at the end of your book, does not Heidegger himself sin against his earlier commitment to the lived life context when, in the period of the contributions to philosophy and beyond, he tries to complete the unfinished work of being in time by thinking being, or sein with a Y, or sein crossed out itself, without the Christ-like mediation of Dasein, kicking Dasein and its life context aside, like Wittgenstein kicking away his ladder and endeavoring to think and speak what otherwise should and would otherwise remain silent, withdrawn, a deus otiosus, or absconditus. Does he, Heidegger, then not end up vaporizing life as it is lived just as much as those he had previously complained about? In this, does not his later thinking become a form of the theoria he despised, rather than the phronesis he had hoped to launch in upon? Or have we misunderstood him from the start, that what he wanted in latching on to life as lived was not really to live that life better or well, as Socrates would have it, or even authentically, as being in time would have it, but to use the phenomena, Dasein in particular, through the lens of his deconstructed phronesis as a recovered pathway to a new sort of theoria, a thinking as thanking of being? You suggest that in contributions, Heidegger transfers care from Dasein and entities to being itself. But in that case, would he be like a doctor operating on himself, not to live life well by curing himself, physician heal thyself, but rather to perform vivisection on life, to understand something beyond the specific lived world under analysis? Why then is the thinking of being any more meaningful than stamp collecting or playing chess, or any other activity that requires our refined and minute attention? If it is not, then is not Heidegger engaging in the very nihilism he deplored? When, as you say, Heidegger in the contributions, quote, seeks to interrogate being itself without relying upon a being par excellence, end quote, has he not arrived at a phenomenologically deconstructed theorein that abandons the factical life that animated him in the early 1920s? In Heidegger's hands, then, does not being become the most empty of concepts after all, the being of the philosopher as detheologized God of the philosophers, despite what he says in Being in Time? Okay, so let me weave this to a second question, this thread, one about the nature of questioning. You write in chapter 2 that, quote, Heidegger, the Heidegger of the early 20s, seeks to avoid resolving Cartesian doubt into object self-certainty and to reassert the legitimacy of the Augustinian quaestio as the authentic being of self-consciousness, end quote. That is, of the properly addressed I am, not Descartes' unexamined sum. I think your insight here is crucial because not only is the quaestio central to Augustine's stance, but also because questioning becomes an indelible feature of Heidegger's method, his metahodos, his Wege nicht Werke, ways, not works. You rightly focus on how Augustine's quaestio allows him to approach God, not making God an object of search, which would be idolatrous, but as a peregrinus, an uncanny pilgrim in this world whose questioning is precisely where he comes to be at home with God. Therefore, the Fruitio Dei takes place, namely in the confessing of the here and now stance of the seeker as unable to carry through the search on his own, which would be a form of Pelagianism if he did think so. The quaestio is itself a confession of the seeker as radically incomplete, as without any ersatz sovereignty to replace God, thereby unable to make either the self or the world whole. In questioning, then, the seeker draws closer to completion by the God who is as yet withdrawn, not only by making God not by making God an object of discovery, but by opening the space for God to approach in the finitude of human being expressed in and through quaestio. This is why it is so important that Augustine's treatment of time begins as a question, quid est ergo tempus? You make the wonderful point that this question itself announces our incompleteness. And if Heidegger is right, that our Dasein is time, then asking this question is tantamount to asking about our being, even if, for Augustine, the question of the meaning of being never gets enacted as such. It is a powerful insight that, as you say, quote, the quaero is meant to take the place of Descartes' cogito, unquote, precisely as the prayerful enactment of our being. This, in turn, sheds light on Heidegger's later pronouncement at the close of the question concerning technology, that questioning is the piety of thinking. So, my third question, can you say more about what this piety is for Heidegger now? By your account, rather than the holding something for true of conventional faith as affirming the truth status of a proposition, faith for Heidegger does not pertain primarily to propositions, but rather designates the properly ecstatic dimensions of Dasein's existence. So then, is it a detheologized correlate for a piety that questions as prayer, and as such seeks a fulfillment in God's grace, as a kind of semi-Pelagianism? Ordinarily, a question intends its fulfillment in an answer, in its completion. But if questioning is piety, then for thinking to become fulfilled would bring both questioning and therefore piety to an end in the aeternitas of God. Must we say, then, that this questioning is circular as the enactment of human finitude, uncannily at home in its endless and so infinite peregrinations? If so, then my third question becomes a fourth. If to question is to confess, implicitly or explicitly, one's incompleteness in the shadow of an imagined plenitude, How do you take Augustine's or Heidegger's quaestio to differ from the Socratic call to the examined life? In the Apology, Socrates challenges and baits the Athenian jury by proclaiming that he will never give up his questioning of himself or of them. He even threatens to go on doing so with the heroes of the underworld if death is not the absolute end. Does this too not indicate a philosophy as a way of life that is at home in its own uncanny finitude, but perhaps more happily at home than Heidegger's or Augustine's? Which leads me to a fifth question. In my own work, I've distinguished between the self-portrait that Socrates gives of himself in the Republic as someone who seeks zetein, and his idealized portrait of the philosopher kings and queens who hold on, ekein, to the truth as a constant possession, the holding for true of propositions that you cited before. But if thinking is an endless seeking that never attains consummation, that is quite literally pointless, and atelekeia, not possessing an end, rather than arriving at entelekeia. What distinguishes this zeticism from nihilism or blank theorein? At a decisive moment in the Republic, Socrates insists upon his own piety, saying that it would be impious, me hosion, of him not to defend justice when it comes under attack. Socratic piety or Socratic faith therefore seems to consist in a refusal to think that the ongoing zetetic inquiry is pointless, especially when decisive questions of how best to live life are at stake. He projects his ideals as heuristics, pole stars for situated, embedded existence without insisting that these ideas are the final truth or doctrinal iconic constancies, as Heidegger would have it in his reading of Plato. Only that hypothesizing them as necessary to make sense of ethical life as we do live it. And as he sees this, without using this terminology, as phenomenologically confirmed when he questions himself and others about what they say they actually believe. I call this a skeptical idealism to indicate the paradoxical interrelationship and tension between faith and thinking, as both are enacted as questioning. Far from detaching him from the world as lived, Socrates' skeptical idealism embeds him in all the more intensely and circumspectly in what I like to call a situated transcendence. So the fifth question: why cannot Heidegger be reconciled to this Socratic zeticism as a rejoinder to nihilism? Yes, of course, there is his rejection of what you rightly recognize as his characterization of metaphysics as the wellspring of nihilism, with the Platonic projection of ideals as a form of constant presence. But I'd like to ask you this: might not Heidegger's hostility to what he takes as Platonism have something to do with what you so brilliantly identify as the cruciform existential structure of questioning that Heidegger detheologizes from the Christian sources he most admires? Both the Christian person and Dasein are broken natures then, incapable in their finitude of a self-sufficient fruitio. This is then quite literally the crux of the question, the quaestio as cross, a seeking after being that ever withdraws. Heidegger literally crucifies being in his later works by drawing a cross through it. We might also say by drawing a Hakenkreuz through it in the 1930s. For Heidegger, is not human finitude confirmed only in Dasein's self-sacrifice, its Opfer, to its polemical encounter with being, so that being may now show itself precisely in its withdrawal through the downfall of Dasein? Indeed, you argue that for Heidegger, Dasein is the conduit, that's a quote, for the sacrificial regrounding of the truth of being. For Heidegger, then, is Dasein's most proper existence confirmed only in tragedy, not comedy, in apocalypse without apotheosis, in crucifixion without resurrection, in the earth opening to swallow up Oedipus, but not the heavens opening to receive Christ. Is not this again nihilism? For Heidegger, questioning, far from a frutio, becomes an agony, a crucifixion, but for Socrates, it is anything but this. His skeptical idealism is his fruitio. And I have a little bit here on the end of the symposium where Socrates insists that the great poet should be able to write both tragedy and comedy. And I think there's something very important in that about Heidegger, since there's not very much funny in Heidegger. And this brings me to my sixth question, and I'll try to close up. Might Heidegger's adoption of the quaestio as a detheologized crux have something to do with his shift of focus from Aristotle in the 20s to Plato in the 30s? And there, we talked about this morning, in my reading of Heidegger's History of Being, his attack on Plato is connected to his attack on modernity and what he calls liberalism in the broadest possible sense, which includes our conception of human rights and so on. So Heidegger says in some of his lectures that if you want to fight Marxism, if you want to fight liberalism, you have to undermine Plato's conception of the ideas. And this brings me to my seventh and final question. What might this reading of Heidegger's detheologized crux have to do with the nature of his deconstruction of the Western tradition? You are absolutely right to note that for Heidegger, the project of deconstruction began as a positive one, violent in his sense, but not a wanton annihilation of the tradition, but rather what you describe as a shaking it up to recover its lost potentialities and reconstruct them in order to prepare room for a new beginning at the end of an age of destitution. But you present a powerful insight at the end of your book, that Heidegger comes to realize, even if not quite explicitly, that the metaphysical and theological modes of reflection are inevitable in their repetition and return, and thus, quote, hardwired into our thinking by the truth of being itself. That Heidegger despairs of finding a, quote, non-metaphysical language, and therefore this is Heidegger's confession, that the sin of the fall into beings takes place in the very attempt to think being purified of all ontic reference. That's right. Does this not again render hopeless and futile the project of destruction? And isn't it remarkable that Heidegger would choose Augustine, whose thought is so indebted to Platonism, as the inspiration for his phenomenological recovery of cura and tempus? Why could Heidegger not see that with Plato's Socrates there is also cura for the world he inhabits, the care of the soul, epimele tes psyches, that he defends both against and for his fellow Athenians in the Apology, rather than pure volatilization into the realm of ideas, that the ideas are Socrates' way of engaging in the care of the self and of others. In your excellent delineation of it, Heidegger's History of Being is generally monolithic and unidirectional in its trajectory. From the failure of early Greek thinking to Plato as the eruption of metaphysics, to Christianity as a transposition of Plato, to Descartes as the elevation of the sum, to the voided sovereignty of the dead God, to Nietzsche's will to power as the final descent into the Pelagian self, as subject as sovereign. A history, as you say, that is now closed. Yet in the sweep of this saga, Augustine occupies an unusual position by your account, because the History of Being does not inundate Augustine's thinking entirely for Heidegger, despite that debt to Platonism. Why cannot more of the tradition be like this, containing multiple, if intertwined, trajectories? What other countercurrents and eddies might we discover to what I do think Heidegger rightly condemns as willful self-pride of the modern subject as the prevailing, but not the only feature of that tradition?
I would like to insist, I insist because I shall partly repeat at the beginning what I said a week ago on the same book. My first remark would be to explain why this book is, to my opinion, opening a new inquiry into Heidegger and giving the opportunity of a new way of understanding it. there are some few other books recently published, both in French, in English, and mostly in French and English. I refer to Christian Sommer and Alexander Schnell and some few others, who tried to consider how far Heidegger was at his early times influenced by Christian theology. And this can be done with Paul, indeed, with Pascal and Luther, and mostly with Augustine. And I think that I know for sure that Ryan Coyne is the first to have addressed the whole issue as such. And he made a good book because he has a very precise question in a very precise field. This field started as some moments. The first moment is the first seminars given by Heidegger in 1921 on Augustinus and Neoplatonismus. This is part of the book 60, volume 60 of the Gesamtausgabe Phänomenologie des religiösen Lebens, where, as we know, he's trying to use some Augustinian concept, Cura, for instance, and in order to make the what will become soon the hermeneutic of factual life. And this being done with not yet a special regard to the question of being, which will start later when he started to make an exegesis and new reading of Aristotle. So we have this first moment, and we can follow up the remnants, the consequences of this first reading of Augustine's in Sein und Zeit. I shall say more about that later. But I think that to those two obvious moments, Ryan Coyne was the first to add two other moments. First, the rather surprising lecture given in the Abbey of Beuron in 1930 as a private lecture, which can be compared to the text on Augustine Confessiones, Book 11 on time, which can be this seminar, which can be read in Gesamtausgabe 83, volume 83rd. And this rereading, the second reading of Augustine by Heidegger, so 9 years later than the first, can be surprising. It can be surprising because it comes after the very clear and to some extent violent explanation given by Heidegger on the possibility of an de-theologized use of Christian thought, and first of all of Augustine. This formulation about the Enttheologisierung of Paul, Luther, Kierkegaard, Pascal, and first of all Heidegger is central during those 9 years. We have a clear example of that in the seminar, volume 59, Phänomenologie des Anschauung und der Ausdruck, where he explicitly used the word entheologisieren. But in fact, it is even in Sein und Zeit, in Being in Time, in section 10, that he says the same thing, that we should try to take the critical meaning and weight and power of some theoretical concepts out of their theoretical context and theological intention in order to deconstruct what metaphysics makes invisible and impractical, which is precisely the refoundation of the question of being, through the hermeneutic of facticity. So there is a methodological question which is asked rather clearly and in a very polemical way in the first period up to the term, that is to the beginning of the 30s, which is, can be formulated this way. Is it legitimate? And other question, is it possible to use theoretical concepts for a philosophical purpose, to deconstruct the metaphysical understanding of being in a way which is not itself related to Christian theology? Because we could perfectly well imagine, this would have been looser again, to use theoretical concepts borrowed from Paul, the New Testament, and so on, and to use them in order to deconstruct the metaphysical interpretation of the word, including the metaphysical theology. After all, this was the attempt of clearly Luther and, to some extent, many other authors, perhaps Pascal at a certain moment, or Kierkegaard. But in the case of Heidegger, it is much more tricky and questionable, because it is to use the power, the deconstructive or destructive power of Christian concept without assuming their Christian origin and their Christian meaning. So it is a double modification of the vocabulary. So Ryan, by studying this period, asked the first question: how could we understand this troublesome expression, de-theologization of theological concepts? That's the first question. And this question is now asked, explained, and it is not yet answered, because it is a huge problem for the entire work of Heidegger. And so we should be very grateful to Ryan for making this question as clear as possible. But he made another discovery, which is, and he recalled that right here, which is much more troubling, that perhaps Heidegger himself could not achieve his own project to de-theologize his own reading of Augustine. And we can have put this hypothesis, to bring this hypothesis in, because as Ryan Coyne very powerfully explained, there is a text, the Anaximander Vorlesung in 1946, which at the acme of the examination, when all the text of Anaximander is reduced to the formulation to kreon. To kreon, which is, according to Heidegger, the Gipfel of the pre-Socratic approach to the question of being. To kreon, which is translated by Heidegger in German as Brauch, is retranslated into Latin as fruitio, with an explicit reference to Augustine, and quotation, two quotations. One quoted and the other just an indication. And this is very puzzling because Heidegger himself could not escape the standing, persisting presence of Augustine, not only as a methodological moment in his polemics against the standard metaphysics at the beginning, but I would say at the end, because we are at that moment at the end of the meditation of Heidegger about being as presence and absence, at that very moment, to connect Anaximander, to explain Anaximander, by recurring to Augustine, it's quite strange. And we have no real explanation about that. So this leads us, and this is the second achievement, and it will be the end of my first remark, to ask ourselves through the book of Ryan Coyne, how far Heidegger himself has enforced his own program, his own agenda. What does that mean? So what is open here, reopen, is the question of the relation between theology and phenomenology. And this picture as a question of the last situation of Heidegger does not match at all the allegedly very simple, in fact, relation between theology and phenomenology, as explained by Heidegger in 29 in the famous Vorlesung on theology and phenomenology. So the question remains open. Indeed, I will not comment everything in the book by Ryan, but I would perhaps make two suggestions to explain why the Augustinian way of thinking could stand, not only be useful to Heidegger, but stand against Heidegger, and to some extent perhaps give some indications that Heidegger could have followed. And I would focus on 2 points. First, the fruitio. You insisted on that. And you make the point, which is absolutely obvious, that Heidegger in 46 is transferring the fruitio, which was used in the Hermeneutik der Affektivität, from the Dasein. It was the Befindlichkeit or Stimmung of the Dasein, the disposition of the Dasein, as anxiety and others, and as Kura, into a determination of being itself. And this is very surprising, how the fruitio could be referred to being itself. So we have to remember, and Ryan is very clear there, is that the problem of being for Heidegger is that being has never its own while. That is, there is no moment when being is there. Being is always there as retracting itself from presence. And so the difficulty is that, paradoxically being, we can be in the presence only of one of the beings and never of being. So how to explain that? And in Augustine, the standard view is that there is the possibility to use or the impossibility to enjoy. To use is to use something, brauchen in the common understanding. Brauch should not refer to fruitio, because in the case of fruitio, You don't use something, you are united to that thing for its own sake. So, if a plain translation of to creon is Brauch, but a plain translation of both is usus, and not frictio. So why Heidegger is translating Brauch by what, from an Augustinian point of view, it is the whole point of Augustine, is the opposite of the usus. In the case of the usus, you use something for the sake of something else which you really love. And in frictio, you don't use anymore something, you enjoy itself for its own sake. So the right translation of Brauch would have been usus, not frictio. So why? Heidegger was aware, more than anyone. Because frictio is not to enjoy. It is to be in the presence of, to be propter, in the case of toward, in the case of Augustine, propter deum. And it is not for Augustine either or. The standard view, and it is the case mostly in the first period in the De Doctrina Christiana, Augustine says, every created thing has to be used and not loved. This would be idolatry. We have to love, and that is frui, only God, because it is the only one which should be loved for its own sake. So we have a divide where creation on one side is only for use, and God is only for frictio. But in some few other texts, and I shall focus only on one, which is the most explicit one. One, in De Trinitate 9, 8, 13, Augustine says that we can refer ourselves to the creation, the creatures, or to the creator, either by cupiditas or by amor. And he adds immediately, this does not mean that creature only should be loved. No, that does not mean that creature should not be loved. But if this love, the love of creatures, is referred to God, to the creature, ad creatorem refertur, it is not yet anymore cupiditas, but caritas. Si ad creatorem refertur ille amor, non iam cupiditas, sed caritas erit. For there is cupidity when a creature is loved for itself, propter se. But when it is something which is equal to us, or a creature inferior to us, which we live, this should be used ad deum, referring ad deum. The creature which is equal to us should be enjoyed, fruendum, but within Deo, in Deo, within God. And sicut enim te ipso, non in te ipso frui debes, the same way that you yourself, you should not enjoy yourself, but in God. This means that, in fact, the frictio can include creation, the other human being, and myself. Under the condition, provided that it is propter deum or in Deo. which means that Fruitio is always the opposite of usus, but it is not limited to God, so to speak. How could it be limited to God if there is no limitation and nothing outside of God? But anyway, the rest of the word of creatura can be included in the Fruitio. And it's only the way to refer to the thing which makes the difference. Either you refer to the thing for themselves, and in that case you cannot avoid idolatry, or you are referred to the presence of the thing insofar as they are themselves in God or referred to God. So Fruitio describes a way to refer to God. So it makes sense, I think, for Augustine to say that Fruitio is another way to experience the whole creation, that is the word and possibly being. So it is not as simple as an opposition between usus frui, which match exactly the opposition between creation and God. In fact, it is two different ways to refer to the same totality, from the point of view of God or not. At that moment, we could understand that Fruitio could be the right relation to being, or whatever the name should be for being. That at the end, the very strange relation, the very strange mode of presence of being, which is always the same than the absence of being. This unstable relation can be described as a case of Fruitio. So here we could try to make a reverse reading, that is to read some Heidegger from the point of view of Augustine. And perhaps Heidegger is indicating this. There is a second point I would just refer briefly to. in Being and Time, section 29, page 139, in a footnote, Heidegger quotes, it is about the Stimmung in the interpretation, he quotes both Pascal, de l'art de persuader, and Augustine. And the main text is Augustine. It is a now famous text from the Contra Faustum, chapter 32, 18, non intratur in veritatem, nisi per caritatem. You could not get into truth but through charity. This is quoted like that. The de-theologization comes by the fact that the context is not quoted. The context of Augustine is to say it is Roman 5:5, the famous text, that we can pray and have access to God through the Holy Spirit, which is given and diffused in our hearts. So this is erased by Heidegger in his quotation. The point, we understand well, that Heidegger, by quoting this, refers to the fact that truth is not only and first a theoretical question. It is a phronesis question, where where knowledge is overruled by another authority, which is whether we love or hate truth. So what is that? No. This doctrine is in fact developed widely and expressly by Augustine in the famous formulation of Confession, Book 10, 2344 about the distinction between the veritas lucians and the veritas relargens. You all know that. Augustine asked himself, why, quoting Terence, why veritas parit odium? Why truth raises hatred? And why, quoting Paul, Galatians 4:16, why the man of God telling truth is hated? And the answer is this. When we see the truth, we may understand quickly, because we see that it is the truth, we may understand quickly that this truth contradicts what we previously have taken for the truth. And so we have, in a Socratic way, to correct our understanding of truth, that is, to destroy your former truth to accept the new truth. And this is precisely what raises the hostility. The hostility, my hostility to truth, or my hostility to the questioning of Socrates, which is the same thing. The result is that truth is not only about knowing truth, this is the first path, but also, and more important, to decide whether we shall bear truth or not. We can sustain the weight of truth and accept it. And in one case, we can reject it and hate it, or if we want to get it, we have to love it. And it's why men love truth when truth is just shedding light, but they hate truth when truth, by shedding light, accuse them. And it's why the question of truth is both theoretical or practical, or better, the distinction between the theoretical point of view and practical point of view does not is impertinent. And this, indeed, is deeply rooted in the understanding of truth by Heidegger. From the beginning to the end, the question of truth is much more than a theoretical question. The question I ask me is why Heidegger has not explicitly discussed the Augustinian doctrine of truth. Heidegger has substituted for love in this formulation many other concepts. In seine Zeit, instead of love, it is the vorläufige Entschlossenheit, the decision by anticipation. Later, it will be the relation of Brauch, or the relation of openness to the ontological difference. But we could try to read a large part of the doctrine of Heidegger on truth, asking ourselves how far it is always a comment, an implementation, a correction of the formulation by Augustine, non intratur in veritatem, nisi per caritatem. So there is a disagreement about the caritas, but there is an agreement about the global definition. Those are two examples of this counter-reading of Heidegger from the point of view of Augustine, matching what was splendidly done by Ryan Coyne as the reading of Heidegger of Augustine by Heidegger. This should be made on both directions, both sides. So I thank you very much, Ryan, for this breakthrough book, which should be, I hope, translated into French.